Hello and welcome again. So this particular little seminar is going to be on how we control blood gases in response to exercise. This is part of your cardiovascular unit, probably the final part that you're going to do. In this particular seminar, we're going to explicitly concentrate on how we regulate blood gases in relation to exercise. Okay, so let's have a look. So first of all, we're going to look at some key terms. We're going to look at things like heart rate. What does that mean? What does cardiac output mean? What does stroke volume mean? Then we're kind of going to have a look at exercise, and in particular we're going to look at the role of these things called chemoreceptors, which basically measure the levels of carbon dioxide in your blood. Okay, so this little seminar is going to be about this first part, control of effectively how we respond, the heart responds to exercise when carbon dioxide levels are building up. Okay, so let's have a look at some key terms to start with. First of all, we have this term that I will need you to define in the work that you are doing for me. Cardiac output. I need you to define this for me. So cardiac output is the volume of blood that is pumped out of your heart with each beat. So therefore it is measured in millilitres of blood per minute. So cardiac output is actually a product or a function of two things. One is heart rate, the other is called stroke volume. Now heart rate, I imagine, is pretty self-explanatory. Heart rate is simply the number of times your heart beats in a minute. Stroke volume, however, might be something which is rather new to you. Stroke volume is actually the volume of blood that's pumped out in each beat. So quite simply, cardiac output is a function equals heart rate times stroke volume. And all I need you to do in the report, the piece of work you're doing for me on cardiovascular, is simply to summarise those terms. You might even just want to put them into a table. I need to see that you understand that cardiac output is equal to heart rate times stroke volume, and I kind of need you to see that you can define what those terms actually mean. Perhaps putting it into a table would be the easiest thing to do. Now, let's now look at changes in blood gases. How do blood gases actually change during exercise? Okay, so you probably know that when you exercise, your muscles are going to need more energy. Energy basically is a product of burning fuel in oxygen. Now the fuel that we use isn't petrol, the fuel that we use is glucose. And of course, if we burn glucose in oxygen, we get a lot more energy than if we actually did not burn it in oxygen. So it's a preferable thing that we burn glucose in oxygen. Now, as a result of making this energy, the cells in your muscles produce a byproduct, almost like the gas that comes out the back of your car, okay? It's a byproduct. You don't want it, you need to get rid of it. In this particular case, the gas that comes out of your cells isn't carbon monoxide, it is carbon dioxide, okay? So unlike what comes out of the car exhaust, which is carbon monoxide, what actually comes out of your cell is carbon dioxide. Now that carbon dioxide we don't want. That carbon dioxide we need to get rid of. So that carbon dioxide is going to enter your bloodstream, namely the capillaries, and those capillaries are going to take it into small veins. Those small veins are going to take it into a larger vein, and that larger vein is going to empty all of that blood back into your heart. Your heart is then going to pump that deoxygenated blood that is literally full of carbon dioxide, all the way to your lungs, where you will breathe out the carbon dioxide, you will breathe in oxygen, comes back to your heart, the whole cycle happens all over again. Now you kind of know that. Now, the issue is, as we start to build up an increased concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood, that carbon dioxide dissolves in the blood, okay, forming something which we call carbonic acid. So we don't actually move carbon dioxide as a gas in the blood, it actually dissolves in the plasma of the blood to become carbonic acid. Now, when those levels of carbon dioxide in the blood, carbonic acid, are building up, the levels of increased carbonic acid are detected by specific receptors. And we're going to look at where we find these receptors in a minute. Now these receptors are actually called chemoreceptors because they are detecting a chemical, so they are detecting carbonic acid in your blood. So as the levels of carbonic acid build up in your blood because you are exercising, then effectively these detectors are going to detect more and more and more and more carbonic acid. In turn, we will see that these detectors basically signal this change, and as a result of that, your heart rate is going to increase. So it's kind of really a nice little kind of process that we go through, but perhaps one of the questions you're asking yourself is, Dave, where do we find these receptors? Where the heck do we find these chemoreceptors? Okay, let's have a look at that. We find them strategically placed in areas where you would not expect to find any carbon dioxide / carbonic acid. You would not expect to find carbon dioxide in areas of your circulatory system that should be exclusively delivering fully 100% or close to it oxygenated blood. So it kind of makes sense that we find these chemoreceptors in the walls of the aorta, which should be detecting 100% oxygenated blood. If these chemoreceptors detect any levels of carbon dioxide where there should be 100% of blood which is oxygenated, it kind of clearly indicates that the heart needs to beat quicker, because we really shouldn't have carbonic acid in the aorta as it leaves the heart. That should be almost 98–99% oxygenated blood. We shouldn't find any carbon dioxide here. Likewise, we shouldn't find any carbon dioxide in your carotid arteries. If you remember, these are the arteries that come up either side of the neck and supply oxygenated blood to your brain. And again, you would not expect to find any carbonic acid or carbon dioxide in these particular arteries here. It should be 99% oxygenated blood. The third place that we find these chemoreceptors is actually in your brain itself. They're monitoring the levels of carbonic acid in the fluid actually surrounding the brain itself. Now you can kind of see that these are all strategically placed. The walls of the aorta, that should be oxygenated blood. If we find carbonic acid there, it's an indicator that you're exercising and that we're not getting rid of all of that carbon dioxide in the pulmonary loop of the circulation. If we find it in your carotid arteries, it means that you're not pumping enough oxygenated blood to your brain, kind of a dangerous thing as well. And thirdly, a fail-safe, if we detect carbonic acid in the fluids surrounding your brain, again, your heart needs to work harder. Now, we kind of know where we detect the levels of carbon dioxide. What the hell happens then? We've detected it, but where's that information going to go? Well, these chemoreceptors basically send nerve impulses along the nerve. You can kind of think of them as a wire, all the way through to a control centre. And that control centre we call the cardiovascular centre, which is in your brain. Specifically, it's in a part of the brain called the medulla oblongata. It's in the medulla oblongata. So these receptors, 1, 2 and 3, will send information about the buildup of carbon dioxide all the way through to a cardiovascular control centre in your brain. Effectively, they are signalling that centre to say there are increased levels of carbonic acid building up. What the hell do you want me to do about it? Okay. So here we have a little slide, and of course all these presentations are on Teams, and you can see the locations of the chemoreceptors. Here they are. I'm going to put them in blue. Chemoreceptors on the aortic arch, chemoreceptors on the carotid artery, and the one that's not on here, of course, is the chemoreceptor in the medulla oblongata, which is actually in your brain at the top. So this is where we have our detectors, our sensors, okay, sending information, because these will send information to the cardiovascular centre, the medulla oblongata, in your brain. So these are all sending information this way constantly about the levels of dissolved carbon dioxide in the blood, carbonic acid. The more carbonic acid, the quicker the signals that are sent. So the more the carbonic acid is building up, the more signals are sent. The frequency of signals to the cardiovascular centre is increased as the levels of carbon dioxide actually increase in the bloodstream. So here we have our wonderful cardiovascular centre. We've already said that it is in the medulla oblongata. What we have not said is how the heck does this control centre influence the build-up of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream? Quite simply, the medulla oblongata, your cardiovascular centre, is connected by nerves, wires, all the way down back to your heart. And specifically, it is connected to your sinoatrial node, which is in the right atrium of your heart. We already know that the sinoatrial node is responsible for increasing or setting, let me correct myself there, the sinoatrial node is responsible for setting myogenic rhythm, the basic rhythm of your heart. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. The basic beating of your heart, maybe once every second, 60 times a minute. Now all of a sudden, that 60 times a minute that it's beating isn't sufficient as a cardiac output to get rid of all that carbon dioxide that's building up because you are exercising. So now it's kind of intuitive that all those receptors sending information all the way to your cardiovascular centre in your brain, that control centre is now going to signal your heart to speed up, to increase cardiac output, to try and get the blood circulating quicker so that more carbon dioxide exits as you breathe out and more oxygen comes in. Okay? So when the medulla oblongata is activated by all of these increases in information coming to it, it's basically going to get your myogenic rhythm to speed up. So in essence, it's going to get the myogenic rhythm in the heart to speed up. It's going to go tachycardic. It's going to speed it up increasingly. So let's just trace that out on here. Here we have two, and I'm going to draw a third one on here. Here we have our chemoreceptors. They are all sending information into the cardiovascular centre in your medulla oblongata. All of them. Because the frequency of information is increasing, that would indicate that carbon dioxide levels in the blood, carbonic acid, is increasing. Your cardiovascular centre responds to this information by sending out a nerve impulse. This nerve impulse I'm going to do in green, and it's going to come from your cardiovascular centre, and it's going to come all the way down here, right through to your sinoatrial node. And that information is basically going to tell your sinoatrial node to speed up. In other words, cardiac output is now going to increase. Why? Because we want the blood to flow to your lungs quicker so that you can get rid of that carbon dioxide when you breathe it out. Okay? Really simple. You will also notice on here, I'm going to draw it in red, that you also have another nerve that comes from your cardiac centre. This particular nerve is going to slow things down, okay? This one is going to slow your heart rate down, it's going to slow cardiac output, okay? We use this one as a break when you have finished exercising, and we're going to look at that right now. Just before we go on to that next slide, you'll see that there's some writing over here. Sympathetic, which is in green, and parasympathetic, which is in red. Broadly speaking, whenever we use these terms sympathetic, it means speed up. Sympathetic nerves tend to speed things up. Parasympathetic nerves tend to slow things So your sympathetic nervous system, it's an automatic, what we call autonomic component of your nervous system, tends to be the part of your nervous system that responds to flight or fight. Whereas your parasympathetic nervous system tends to be the one associated with rest and digest. Now in this particular case, your sympathetic nerves speed things up, your parasympathetic slow heart rate down. So can people see how that kind of loops right the way round? We take information from these chemoreceptors, we feed it into a control centre in your brain. The control centre diagnoses what is going on. If carbon dioxide levels are building up in these strategic areas, it tells the heart to speed up. Once carbon dioxide levels start to decrease, it then tells the control centre, then tells the sinoatrial node to slow down. So this is constantly happening all the time, throughout the day, whether you are awake or whether you are asleep. Constantly regulating the levels of carbon dioxide in your blood by regulating how quickly your heart beats, in other words, what your cardiac output is. So, this is a really useful summary slide. This basically tells you everything that you need to know about how chemoreceptors work and the events that lead to them detecting increased levels of carbonic acid, sending signals to the cardiovascular centre, and then sending signals right the way through to the sinoatrial node. It's a great summary slide. Hint, it might be one that you might want to consider very carefully when you are preparing your response to this particular part of the assignment brief. I hope this little tiny tutorial assists you in doing that. Remember, all of these PowerPoints are on Teams. All of them are on Teams. Thanks very much. Bye.